This is number 35 in my series Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In this podcast, we're going to look at the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was a huge event with a lot of military and political moving parts. It would take a good 10-part podcast series to cover all of it, so in this single podcast, we're only going to scratch the surface. If you've been listening to these podcasts, you may have noticed increasingly familiar names popping up. In recent podcasts, we've mentioned Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Samuel Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. In my last podcast, I discussed King George's War, which occurred in the 1740s, and by that time, nearly all of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were alive. From here on out, the names of the men that we would traditionally identify as America's founding fathers will pop up frequently. From 1754 to 1760, France and Britain fought the fourth and final war for control of North America, popularly known as the French and Indian War. It would be the largest war fought in North America up to that point, but it was only one theater of a much larger war raging in Europe and in other places called the 7 Years' War, which was the largest war Europeans had ever engaged in up to that point. It was truly a world war, with fighting occurring on 4 continents, and like all of the other wars, Spain would get dragged into the conflict, which provided opportunities for the British to seize Spanish territories in the Caribbean, including Cuba. Unlike previous struggles for control of North America, which started in Europe and then spilled over into North America, the French and Indian War started in North America and then triggered war in Europe. And the person who provided the spark that ignited the war was a young and inexperienced Virginia militia officer named George Washington. Initially, the French had the upper hand, and it seemed to be winning the war because their influence with the various Indian tribes ensured their control of the backcountry where the war started. In the end, however, the British would win the war spectacularly, but victory was ultimately illusory and would embroil the British Empire in new and thorny crises. In my opinion, the French and Indian War laid the foundation of the modern world as we know it today. The map on the screen gives you some idea of what North America looked like at the beginning of the war. The British in red were along the eastern seaboard of North America. The French were up in Canada and in the Great Lakes region and down through the Mississippi into Louisiana. And the Spanish were down south in Florida. The British colonies had a much bigger population base, probably about 1.5 million people. Some estimates vary more or less. And the French had much fewer people in their colonies and spread out over a much larger area, probably less than 70,000 people. Before we go any further, it might be a good idea to talk about the forts that were built in the backcountry during the French and Indian War. On the screen now is a map showing all of the forts, which are the red dots, that were involved in the French and Indian War. Now, this map doesn't show all of the forts in North America. It just shows the ones that were involved in the French and Indian War. If you read a textbook account of the French and Indian War, you might get confused quickly over the geography because there's armies and explorers marching here and there, and you find yourself constantly having to look at some kind of atlas or map or Googling these locations. So I'll try and keep my maps and depictions as simple and free of extraneous things as much as possible. All of the forts that were built next to water, either next to a lake or a river. As I mentioned in previous podcasts, the lakes and rivers were the highways of the backcountry. So controlling lakes or rivers was a way of controlling commerce as well as security. Most notably, between New York and Quebec is the Lake Champlain, Lake George, Hudson River Valley water system. And you can see that on the map. There's a string of forts that run along it between New York and Quebec, even though I don't actually show the lakes and rivers on there. Most of the war was about capturing and building these forts in the backcountry. At this point, I think it's very important to take a look at the Ohio country, which is where the war starts. On the screen is a map showing the Ohio country. For reference, the red lines on the map show the modern boundaries of the state of Pennsylvania. The French were concerned that if the British colonists continued to push and migrate westward, that would interfere with French relationships with the Indians and French control of the southern Great Lakes. The French also worried that if British colonists continued to push westward, the French might lose control of the Mississippi River itself. In 1749, the French attempted to take formal possession of the Ohio country by sending an expedition who deposited lead plates along the Ohio River, making a formal claim by the King of France to that area. I think they recognized that really control of the area would come down to who could colonize it and occupy it first. And of course, the British did not recognize the French claims to the area. In 1753, Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia sends a young major, George Washington, accompanied by some Indian scouts and an interpreter, with a formal message demanding that the French evacuate the region. And Washington came to Fort Le Boeuf. You can see that on the northern part of the map there, where he gave this message to the French commandant at that fort. The French told Washington to bug off, so Washington went home, basically telling them that the French don't recognize our demands that they leave the region. If you look carefully at the map, you can see how the Monongahela and the Allegheny rivers meet to form the Ohio River. Controlling this spot where the confluence of these two rivers was critical to controlling the backcountry. So the British began building a fort right at the forks of the river there, but a larger French force showed up and shooed them away and started building their own fort called Fort Duquesne after the French governor of Canada. And that's, of course, the modern site of Pittsburgh. In order to keep an eye on the French, George Washington and his men built a small fort called Fort Necessity. You can see it there on the map. It was a small circular structure, not very impressive, kind of a backwoods deal. And in May of 1754, a small party of French officers and men and Indians were traveling southeast. And when Washington found out about it, he and his men went to go investigate, and they ended up having a skirmish with this French party and killing most of them, including a French officer named Jumonville. A little over a month later, in July, the French retaliated by sending a large force of French and Indians to attack Fort Necessity, where Washington and his men were at. Overwhelmed by the French and their Indian allies, Washington decided to surrender Fort Necessity on July 4th. It's kind of an ironic date when you think about it. Of course, at the time, it didn't mean anything to anybody. The surrender terms were written in French, and unfortunately, Washington didn't know what he was signing, and he agreed in signing it because it was written in there. He agreed that he had assassinated Jumonville and this French party a month earlier that we talked about. As soon as Fort Necessity was surrendered, the French Indian allies rushed in and began killing and scalping the British sick and wounded. This would be a problem in later battles as well. It was hard to control Indian allies. Washington had been keeping Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia, informed of what was going on, and so all of this was then sent on to London, and the British government decided to take the backcountry seriously. So in 1754, they sent over General Braddock with several thousand regular troops. They were going to make a serious attempt at gaining control of the Ohio country. One of the remarkable events that also occurred in 1754 was the Albany Congress. The king had ordered the governors to send delegates to a congress to be held in Albany, New York, and the purpose of this congress initially was to coordinate efforts with the Iroquois Confederation and to get them on board in dealing with the French. One of the delegates, though, Ben Franklin from Pennsylvania, he suggested a plan of union that would have put all the colonies under one government. The plan called for a president general to be chosen by the crown, and then a national legislature where each of the colonies would send representatives. The colonies traditionally had a chronic lack of cooperation among themselves. Had this government been set up or this plan implemented, it probably would have improved things a great deal. It's interesting to speculate about what would have happened had the plan of union that Franklin was suggesting been put into place. Would the American War of Independence have even occurred? That's a good question you can speculate about. Ultimately, though, both London and the colonies themselves were not interested in setting up some kind of government that would govern all of the colonies under one umbrella. Crown officials feared that it might lead to a spirit of independence, and the individual colonial legislatures didn't want to give up the control they had over finances or in other areas. On the screen now is a map that shows the British campaigns for 1755. As you look at the map and all the battles that occurred, it's interesting and important to note that there was no official declaration of war yet between France and England. The British just simply decided they were going to expel the French from the backcountry, and the French had decided the same thing. The British had begun to take the war seriously, so they sent over General Braddock with a lot of regular troops, and he was to raise militia and provincial troops to a total of about 2,500 men. He was to attack Fort Duquesne and then move north to help with operations in Canada. A separate force was to attack Fort Niagara and capture it. A third force was to head north along the Hudson and Lake Champlain River Valley system and attack Fort St. Frederick, and then head north to attack areas further north in Canada. So this was the master plan, but it didn't quite work out that way. Braddock did march towards Fort Duquesne in the backcountry of what is now Pennsylvania. He was killed, and his mission was a fiasco. We'll say more about him in a few minutes. With Braddock dead, Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts became the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America. Shirley led a force of about 2,500 men north. You can see it on the map there. He attacked and was captured successfully Fort Oswego, which was really not defended. From there, he was going to attack and capture Fort Niagara, which he was not able to do. His men were undersupplied. Many of them suffered from high disease rates, and there were high desertion rates as well. But capturing Fort Oswego was important because from here, the British could interfere with French supply and communication lines into the backcountry. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs and was also a bitter political enemy of Shirley, he led a force of about 3,500 combined of militia and Mohawk Indians further north, building roads to what is today Lake George and constructing forts Fort William Henry and Fort Edward. He was also supposed to attack Fort St. Frederick, the French fort further north at the south end of Lake Champlain. During these operations, they were attacked by a French force, but Johnson's men prevailed. In fact, the French commander was killed. One of the reasons that Shirley's campaign didn't do so well was that Johnson was able to siphon off some of the supplies and men, especially Mohawk Indians, that Shirley was relying on to do his campaign. So the division and infighting was always a factor when you're dealing with the colonies. If you look to the center right of the screen, you'll see where Nova Scotia is. A force of over 2,000 men, most of it militia, seized the French forts of Beauchesneau and Gaspereau. The placement of these two forts was very important. You can see from the map that the little narrow neck of land that connects Nova Scotia to the mainland is where these forts were built, and the British wanted to make sure they controlled them. If you look at the map where Nova Scotia is, it was an area that the French originally had colonized, and they called it Acadia, or rather it was part of Acadia, and there were a lot of French settlers here. The British conquered this area in Queen Anne's War, which we've talked about in a previous podcast, and then ruled it from there on out. But the people, the French settlers in Acadia, weren't happy being British subjects, and though many of them would not take up arms against the British, they also would not take an oath of loyalty to the British king. The British had planned to try and import as many Protestants from Europe, from Germany or from other places, to try and make it more Protestant and more British, but that never really worked out. In 1755, the British were concerned that the Acadians living there, who were French and Catholic, might side with the French government, and they began deporting them by the thousands from that area, moving them to their other colonies. Many of the Acadians fled to other places in Canada. Some ended up in France. Some ended up in Louisiana. As many as 7,000 in 1755 alone, and many thousands more in subsequent years would be deported and moved to other areas. Thousands of them died in the process too. But it was a ruthless way of depopulating the area, and then they could later resettle it with British and German Protestants. I want to return now to talking about General Braddock's expedition. It was one of the biggest fiascos of the war. Braddock was sent over from Britain with a large army of regular soldiers, and he was made commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America. He expected a relatively easy victory. He had a lot of artillery. He was expecting to go to Fort Duquesne and blast out the French in a European-style battle, which is not exactly what happened. If you look on the screen now, you see the map showing the plan of what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to build a road from Fort Cumberland. You can see that down on the right-hand lower part of the screen, all the way up to Fort Duquesne. This was a daunting task. This was raw wilderness, lots of mountains to cross, a big forest to go through, a lot of work. Braddock had 3 aides de camp. One of them was George Washington. He picked Washington because Washington already had experience in the backcountry, which turned out to be a fortunate choice later. Washington helped save Braddock's army once the disaster hit. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Braddock also recruited among the Colonials, and by the time he was done, he had about a 2,500-man force. There were problems as soon as Braddock stepped off the boat. There was always the difficulty of getting the colonies to cooperate or pool resources. They weren't willing to spend on things outside their colonies. Not only that, the Quakers that ran Pennsylvania were never happy to spend money on military projects for their own defense or for an army to be sent back into the backcountry. And many in Pennsylvania felt this was a Virginian affair. Why should they cooperate? Luckily for Braddock, Benjamin Franklin was able, with his influence, to scrape together resources and supplies that Braddock would need and to get Braddock underway. One of the biggest mistakes that Braddock made was he didn't properly make use of Indian allies that he should have. Braddock was somewhat insulting to the Indians. He didn't feel they were worth much, that they could help much. He felt that his army was powerful enough. He could just march right back into the backcountry, dislodge the French, and push onward up into Canada. This was contrary to what both Ben Franklin and George Washington had warned Braddock about. They tried to get him to change his strategy with regard to the Indians. In a comment to Ben Franklin, Braddock made these comments. He said, These savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the king's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible to believe they should make any impression. It was a critical mistake, and right up to the very end, Braddock never seemed to grasp the nature of the warfare that he would be forced to engage in. So during the summer of 1755, Braddock and his army pushed westward from Fort Cumberland, building the road as they went. They were able to build about 2 miles a day of road. This was a very difficult task, very backbreaking work. It entailed cutting down lots of trees. It entailed blasting out rocks over steep cliffs, and in some cases having to traverse very steep hills and things. A lot of work. They were being watched most of the way, and of course, stragglers were sometimes picked off by Indians and scalped. These were allied Indians to the French. And as they got closer to Fort Duquesne, these kinds of encounters happened more often. There's one area just a little west of Fort Cumberland that I think is worth talking about. It was an area that the men called the Shades of Death Forest. And I've got a picture of it there on the screen for you to look at, what it looks like today. One person who went through the Shades of Death Forest much later than Braddock's expedition described it in these poetic terms. He said, "The loneliness and perfect monotony of such a scene are not readily to be described. It more resembled the utter stillness of the desert than anything beside. No bird chirps among the foliage or finds its food in these inhospitable boughs. No wild creature has its lair beneath its leafy gloom. Like the dark nave of some endless dream-born cathedral, the tall columns rise before, behind, on every side, in uncounted and bewildering multiplicity, and are lost in the thick mantle that shuts out the light of heaven. The senses wear of the confusing prospect, and imagination paints 1,000 horrid forms to people its recesses. At every step the traveler half looks to find a bloody corpse or the blanched skeleton of some long murdered man lying across his pathway through these woods, so aptly named the Shades of Death." As Braddock's army got within 10 miles of Fort Duquesne, a force of about 1,000 men, 200 of it French militia and French regular soldiers, and the rest of it, about 700-800 men, were Indians, left Fort Duquesne to intercept the British army. Just as the British Army forced the Monongahela River, you can see it there on the map, right at where the town of Braddock is today in Pennsylvania. There's actually a town named Braddock named after General Braddock. This force of French and Indians collided with the British Army and then started enveloping it. Braddock tried to get his men to form up, and of course they were picked off by snipers and people hiding behind trees. And in the confusion, the British soldiers began to panic and fall back upon each other. The French and the Indians were hiding behind trees and in bushes, and many of the British officers complained that they never saw more than 5 enemy soldiers were being fired at from every direction. Pretty soon the confusion turned into panic, then what ensued was somewhat of a slaughter. General Braddock himself was wounded and later died. Washington was on hand. He was the one that helped pick up Braddock before he died. He started organizing the retreat and trying to get the men out of there in an orderly fashion. He knew, too, that they would have time as long as they moved quickly because the Indians would stop to scalp the dead and the dying, and that they would plunder the baggage train. So while the Indians were drinking the liquor and scalping the dead, Washington was able to get his men evacuated out, and the French couldn't go any further without their Indian allies. They were too few in number. That evening, as the French allied Indians came to trickle back into Fort Duquesne, a British captive who was being held in Fort Duquesne described what they brought back. All of them had brought back scalps. Many of them brought back wagon loads of supplies that they had captured from the British, and many of them were wearing British uniforms or grenadier caps or sporting British guns. So they brought back all these trophies. Not only the trophies, but they had brought back a number of captives, which that evening they tortured and killed along the banks of the Allegheny River right near Fort Duquesne where the Indian camp was. The British captive who was being held in the fort described what he saw in these words. He said, "I stood on the fort wall until I beheld them begin to burn one of these men. They had him tied to a stake and kept touching him with firebrands, red-hot irons, etc. And he screamed in a most doleful manner, the Indians in the meantime yelling like infernal spirits. As the scene appeared too shocking for me to behold, I retired to my lodging, both sore and sorry." The French, for their part, didn't like to tolerate what the Indians did to captives, but they knew that if they interfered too much, they would lose their Indian allies, and the Indian allies were critical for this war with the British. Braddock's expedition was one of the biggest disasters in British military history, but it taught George Washington a lot of things, and it made the British, in a way, take the war a little more seriously, I think. In the end, the casualties were that the British lost about 800 killed and wounded, while the French only lost about maybe 30 to 100 men, both Indians as well as French and Canadian militia troops. With the British disasters of 1755, the French and their Indian allies decided it was time to go on the offensive. On the screen now is a map showing these offensives during the years 1756 and 1757. In May of 1756, a formal declaration of war between France and Britain was finally declared, and now the two nations were officially at war. The French seized back Oswego from the British, and it didn't help British morale any that their commander, the fort commander, he was decapitated by a cannonball during the cannonading. As soon as the fort was surrendered, the French Indian allies quickly broke into the fort hospital and began seizing British captives, scalping and killing others. The French felt bad for these men, so they actually bought them back from the Indians with gifts of brandy and other things. In August of 1757, Fort William Henry was seized by the French after a siege and cannonade. On the map, you'll see several red explosions in the Pennsylvania backcountry. After the failure of Braddock to capture Fort Duquesne, the French used Fort Duquesne as a base to arm and supply and encourage the Indians to raid the British backcountry. The raiding caused terror among British colonists, many of whom were killed or captured. Some of them were tortured to death. Many of them were adopted into Indian tribes, and many of them fled further east to the safety of heavily populated areas. So pretty much everything the British had gained, what little they had gained, except for in Nova Scotia, was undone by these French and Indian offensives. As disastrous as these 2 years were for the British, there were changes occurring that would change the course of the war in favor of the British. One of these most important changes came in the person of William Pitt, who gained power in Britain and changed the direction of the war in North America. Traditionally, when wars between France and Britain occurred, both of those countries focused on their fighting in Europe and kind of gave the North American theater very little attention, just kind of hold the line there. Pitt did the exact opposite. He decided they would hold the line in Europe and instead focus their strength on North America and expel the French. He felt that was the only true way to victory. This war strategy worked ultimately, but it did leave the British with a huge war debt. Pitt also did things to try and make the colonists feel a little better. He, for example, reimbursed the colonies for their expenses during the war. Another thing he did was change the rules that said that any British regular officer outranked any militia officer. So consider this. This meant that you could be a militia general, and yet the greenest, newest lieutenant outranked you. So he changed that so there was parity instead. And that, I think, helped soothe some of the ruffled feathers in the colonies. On the screen now is a map showing British offensives during 1758. With the new mission and resupply, the British began attacking French forts in the backcountry and keeping the French on the defensive. In July, a large British force attacked Fort Carillon, but the incompetent British commander, Abercrombie, didn't properly support the attack with artillery, and the French had laid out a bunch of fallen trees that the men had to get through, the British attackers had to get through, and while they were doing that, withering gunfire killed many of them. It was a disaster for the British. Also in July, though, the British were successful in capturing Louisbourg up there in Nova Scotia. You can see it off to the right of the map on your screen. It's considered the strongest fortress in North America, yet the British never seemed to have a problem capturing it, since they captured it during King George's War, too. In August of 1758, the British succeeded in capturing Fort Frontenac, which was probably the most important thing the British did that year, arguably during the whole entire war, because it cut French access off to the backcountry and the interior. This meant that they couldn't continue to send gifts to their Indian allies to keep them on their side. They couldn't communicate well now with Fort Duquesne or any of the backcountry. On your screen now is a map of the Forbes expedition. This was also done in 1758. Forbes's mission, just like Braddock's before him, his mission was to capture Fort Duquesne. Forbes decided on a more direct route right through Pennsylvania. You can see it on the map. The red line indicates Braddock's road that he built, and the heavy black line shows Forbes's new road that he built. Without the presence to buy off the Indian allies that the French had been doing, the French situation in Fort Duquesne became perilous. There was no way really to hold it now without their Indian allies. So in November of 1758, the French blew up the fort just about the time that the forward elements of Forbes's expedition were arriving. They could hear the explosion, and then the French abandoned the site. The British built a bigger fort on the location and called it Fort Pitt after William Pitt in England. And of course, that's the origin of the name Pittsburgh today. By the end of 1758, the momentum of the war had definitely shifted in Britain's favor. On the screen now is a map showing British operations and campaigns for the year 1759. Momentum had definitely shifted in favor of the British. The British were spending enormous fortunes on the war, both in men and materiel, as well as navy power, to win the war, and it was paying off. That year, a British army seized control of Fort Niagara, and along with Fort Frontenac, which they'd captured the previous year, gave them control over Lake Ontario. At the south end of Lake Champlain, the British captured the French Fort Carillon, which they renamed Fort Ticonderoga, and they also captured Fort St. Frederick, which they renamed Crown Point. At this point, not only had the British expelled the French from the backcountry, but they were now focusing on the capital of Canada, Quebec. The British were able to finally capture Quebec after a battle at the Plains of Abraham. Controversially, the British had done kind of a scorched earth policy around Quebec, destroying thousands of homes and farms, trying to keep the French on the defensive. Unhappily for the British, though, the French army defending Quebec was able to get out of the city before they were able to capture it, so they returned the next season to try and recapture it from the British, which they were not able to do. On the screen now is a map showing the fighting for the last year of the French and Indian War, 1760. The British had been able to capture Quebec in the previous year, but the French attacked the city, and the British commander defending the city, his men were sick with scurvy and frostbite. It was a bad winter. Decided it would be better to leave Quebec, go outside the fortifications, and fight them in the open fields, which they did. There were heavy casualties. The British fled back into the city, and the French came close to recapturing Quebec. This is where British sea power came into play. The British were able to strangle Canada with their sea power. The French couldn't get supplies or new men or ammunition or anything to their forces in Canada, and this was a decisive factor in determining who would finally control Quebec. The French were not able to get it back. The only thing left for the British to do now was to capture Montreal. We talked earlier about Lieutenant Colonel Johnson. He was the superintendent of Indian affairs. He was very effective at sometimes in his ways of dealing with the Indians. He was able to neutralize many of the Indians along the St. Lawrence River, and they decided not to help the French anymore. Had those Indians, which had traditionally been French allies, had they decided to help the French, it would have made the job of the British much more difficult. But in the end, they didn't decide to, and Montreal fell pretty easily to British forces. So after the fall of Montreal, fighting in North America ended, but the war dragged on in Europe and in other places until 1763, until a formal peace treaty was signed. As I mentioned earlier, the fighting went on all around the world. It was in the Philippines, India, Africa, and in the Caribbean as well. The British had captured Cuba from Spain, and in exchange for getting it back, Spain surrendered Florida to the British. One of the things that the British and the colonists learned from these wars, well, they learned earlier than this, but it was particularly emphasized during this war, was the value of having irregular forces that could fight in the backcountry. Units of Rangers had existed for several decades now, and they were quite effective. And it wasn't that they learned how to fight like the Indians so much as they learned how to survive in the forest like the Indians for long periods of time. They were seen as an elite force, and they were very good at what they did. But no matter how much backcountry fighting was done, I think the real determinant in this war was sea power. Canada was never able to really supply itself with food. It couldn't manufacture what it needed. And when British sea power strangled it because they were able to keep French supply ships from coming in, I think that Canada just kind of slowly withered on the vine. They weren't able to stand up to the British. The British overwhelmed the French. During the course of the war, they had close to 50,000 men at arms, half of which was colonial militia. They just simply overwhelmed the French. The final peace treaty gave the British all of France's territory east of the Mississippi, except for New Orleans, and Canada, so the British were now masters of North America. There was a huge celebration on both sides of the Atlantic. The French menace had finally been removed. I don't think the British realized yet that some of their miseries were just beginning, because the victory in the war led to certain other crises, including the American Revolution and the rebellion by the American colonists. In our next podcast, I'm going to take a careful look at George Washington's part in the French and Indian War. He played an important part in it and learned a few things to help prepare him to be Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. For further information on this subject, I recommend the following books and articles. The War That Made America, A Short History of the French and Indian War by Fred Anderson. Tomahawk and Musket, French and Indian Raids in the Ohio Valley, 1758, by René Chartrand and Peter Dennis. The Colonial Wars, 1689 to 1762, by Howard H. Peckham. Braddock's March, How the Man Sent to Seize a Continent Shaped American History, by Thomas E. Crocker. Monongahela, 1754 to 1755, Washington's Defeat, Braddock's Disaster, by René Chartrand and Stephen Walsh. The Acadians of Nova Scotia, Past and Present, by Sally Ross and Alphonse Deveau. American Colonial Ranger, The Northern Colonies, 1724 to 1764, by Gary Zaboli. Montcalm's Crushing Blow, French and Indian Raids Along New York's Oswego River, 1756, by René Chartrand. The French Indian War, 1754 to 1760, by Daniel Marston. The Scratch of a Pen, 1763, and the Transformation of North America, by Colin G. Calloway. Struggle for a Continent, The Wars of Early America, by John Ferling. Raiders from New France, North American Forest Warfare Tactics, 17th and 18th Centuries, by René Chartrand and Adam Hook. The Carlisle House and its Associations, Braddock's Headquarters, Here the Colonial Governors Met in Council, April 1755, by Richard Henry Spencer, published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 18, No. 1, July 1909. Conscience, The Quaker Community and the French and Indian War, by Jack D. Marietta, published in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, Volume 95, No. 1, January 1971. Exile on Spruce Street, An Acadian History, by Christopher Hodson, published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 67, No. 2, April 2010. Cooperation of the Southern Colonies in the Forbes Expedition against Fort Duquesne, by Paul H. Giddens, published in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, Volume 36, No. 1, January 1928. The Albany Congress and the Creation of Indian Superintendencies, by John R. Alden, published in the Mississippi Valley Historical Review, Volume 27, No. 2, September 1940. And Pennsylvania-Virginia Rivalry for the Indian Trade of the Ohio Valley, by W. Neal Franklin, published in the Mississippi Valley Historical Review, Volume 20, No. 4, March 1934.